Have you ever wondered what you'd do if you stumbled upon a life hanging by a thread in the midst of a blizzard? Today's story will leave you stunned at what one man discovered chained to a tree in the Montana wilderness. What happens next will break your heart and then restore your faith in humanity. In the next few minutes, you'll witness the extraordinary journey of Ethan and Loki, from a desperate rescue in sub-zero temperatures to an unbreakable bond that defies explanation. This isn't just another animal rescue story. It's a tale of conspiracy, experiments gone wrong, and the incredible intelligence hidden within a creature society had thrown away. Before we dive in, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly stories of remarkable animal rescues. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. I love connecting with our global family of animal lovers. Now, brace yourself for the story that's leaving thousands of viewers in tears and demanding justice. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy Montana snow as Ethan Carter squinted through the glass. His knuckles had turned white from gripping the steering wheel for the past 3 hours. The heater in his old Ford F-150 wheezed and sputtered, barely keeping up with the biting cold that had settled across the Bitterroot Mountains. Ethan, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer with deep-set hazel eyes and 3-day stubble, was heading back to his cabin after an unsuccessful attempt to capture images of elk herds in winter. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who spent more time outdoors than in, with crow's feet at the corners of his eyes and skin tanned even in February. "Should have listened to the weather report," he muttered, tuning the radio only to hear static. Cell service had disappeared an hour ago when he turned onto this back road, a shortcut he now regretted taking. The snow fell in thick curtains, transforming the dense pine forest on either side of the narrow county road into shadowy sentinels. It was nearly 5 p.m., and daylight was fading fast. The temperature gauge on his dashboard read 12 degrees Fahrenheit and continuing to drop. Ethan took a swig from his thermos, the coffee long since gone cold, and grimaced. His plans to reach Missoula before nightfall were looking increasingly unrealistic. The roads were becoming treacherously slick, and the county plows rarely made it out this far during storms. "Just get home in one piece," he reminded himself, something his late father used to tell him. No photograph is worth freezing to death for. That's when something caught his eye, a dark shape just off the road, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree limb, but there was something unnaturally vertical about it. Ethan slowed the truck, peering through the passenger window. "What the hell?" he whispered, as the shape seemed to move slightly. He pulled the truck over, the tires crunching through the fresh snow. Grabbing his heavy Carhartt jacket and flashlight from the passenger seat, he hesitated for just a moment. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and stepping outside meant exposing himself to dangerous conditions. 5 minutes, he promised himself. Just check it out and get back on the road. As he opened the door, the wind slammed against him with physical force. It stole his breath away instantly, the cold air burning his lungs. Pulling his wool hat lower and wrapping a scarf around his face, Ethan trudged through the knee-deep snow toward whatever had caught his attention. The beam of his flashlight bounced wildly as he struggled to maintain his balance. 50 yards from the road, the trees grew thicker, and the wind howled through the pines with an almost human moan. "Hello," he called out, feeling foolish. "Anyone there?" Only the wind answered, whistling through the branches above. But as he moved closer, the shape began to take form, something dark against the white snow, partially hidden behind a large pine tree. 3 more steps, and Ethan froze. "Oh my God," he gasped, his warm breath creating a cloud in the frigid air. There, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight, was no fallen branch or trick of the eye. It was unmistakably an animal, a large canine figure, partially covered by drifting snow, chained to the base of a massive pine tree. And as Ethan stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest, he realized what he was looking at. A wolf, nearly motionless in the gathering darkness, its gray coat almost indistinguishable from the twilight shadows. Only the shallow rise and fall of its ribs indicated it was still alive. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he approached the chained wolf. The animal was larger than any dog he'd ever seen, its frame suggesting it would be imposing at full health, but now it was terribly emaciated. Its ribs protruded sharply beneath a dull, matted coat that should have been thick and luxurious for winter. "Hey there," Ethan whispered, keeping his voice low and steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The wolf's eyes, barely open, tracked his movement, but it made no attempt to growl or show aggression. It simply lacked the strength. The chain was industrial grade, wrapped multiple times around the tree and secured with a heavy padlock at the wolf's neck. A thin layer of ice had formed where the metal collar met fur, and patches of skin were raw and bleeding where the animal had tried to free itself. "Who would do this?" Ethan muttered, anger rising like bile in his throat. "Who would just leave you out here to die?" The wolf's ears twitched slightly at his voice, but otherwise it remained motionless. Its breathing was labored, each inhale a visible struggle. Judging by the trampled snow and waste around the tree, Ethan estimated the animal had been there for at least several days. He knelt in the snow, moving cautiously to avoid startling the creature. "I'm going to help you, okay? Just stay calm." The wolf's eyes, a remarkable pale gold that seemed almost luminous in the beam of the flashlight, regarded him with what Ethan could only interpret as resigned acceptance. It was the look of an animal that had given up hope. Examining the chain, Ethan realized he would need tools from his truck. The wind whipped around him mercilessly as he stood, his fingers already numb despite his gloves. "I'll be right back," he promised, though he wondered if the wolf would even be alive when he returned. Racing back to his truck, slipping twice on the icy ground, Ethan's mind raced through possibilities. The wolf was clearly not wild, or at least not entirely. Its presence here, chained, suggested human involvement. In Montana, wolf-dog hybrids weren't uncommon, though they were controversial and often difficult to keep. He grabbed his emergency kit from behind the seat, a habit instilled by years of solo backcountry trips. It contained bolt cutters, originally packed for cutting fence if he ever got stranded, but they might work on the chain. "Hang in there, buddy," Ethan said, returning to the wolf's side. The animal's condition seemed to have deteriorated just in the few minutes he'd been gone. Its eyes were now fully closed, snow accumulating on its fur. Using the flashlight clenched between his teeth, Ethan examined the chain more closely. Frozen links held the wolf tightly to the tree, allowing barely enough slack for the animal to lie down. There was no food or water in sight. This was deliberate, Ethan realized with mounting horror. Someone had driven this wolf deep into the forest during a blizzard and left it to die a slow, painful death. He tried the bolt cutters on the chain, but the metal was too thick. The padlock seemed more promising, old and rusted, but the keyhole was filled with ice. "We need to get you warm," Ethan told the wolf, removing his jacket despite the biting cold and draping it over the animal's body. "And I need to thaw this lock." The wolf's only response was a shallow exhalation that formed a small cloud in the freezing air. Ethan looked back toward the distant road where his truck's headlights cut feebly through the intensifying storm. Night had fully settled now, and the temperature was plummeting. If he didn't free the wolf soon, neither of them might survive the night. "I didn't find you just to watch you die," Ethan said firmly, rubbing his hands together and preparing for what would be the most difficult rescue of his life. The wind howled through the pines, driving snow horizontally into Ethan's face as he worked on the frozen chain. His fingers, now stripped of gloves to manage the delicate work, had lost almost all sensation, turning an alarming shade of white that warned of impending frostbite. Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth, his breath crystallizing instantly in the frigid air. Ethan had managed to retrieve a small canister of de-icer from his truck's emergency kit, originally intended for frozen door locks. He applied it carefully to the padlock, watching as it melted the ice crystals that had formed in the keyhole. The wolf beneath his jacket had grown disturbingly still. "Stay with me," he urged, periodically checking the animal's breathing. Each exhale from the wolf was fainter than the last. The bolt cutters proved useless against the heavy-duty chain, but Ethan refused to give up. Using the handle of the tool, he hammered at the partially thawed padlock, his hands screaming in pain with each impact. The thermometer on his watch read 5 degrees Fahrenheit and falling, dangerously cold, especially with the wind chill. "Damn it," he shouted as the bolt cutters slipped from his numb grip, cutting a gash in his palm. Blood trickled down his wrist, freezing almost immediately against his skin. Ethan barely felt the wound, a dangerous sign of how cold he'd become. The wolf's eyes flickered open briefly at his outburst, those strange golden irises finding his for just a moment before sliding closed again. "Don't you give up," Ethan said firmly. "We're getting out of here together, you hear me?" He retrieved the fallen tool and changed tactics, using the pointed end to work at the lock's mechanism directly. His wilderness survival training had included basic lock-picking, though he'd never imagined using the skill in these circumstances. Minutes passed like hours. Ethan lost track of time as he worked, his world narrowing to the padlock, the wolf's increasingly shallow breathing, and the battle against his own body's response to the cold. His movements became clumsier, his thoughts sluggish, classic symptoms of hypothermia setting in. "My sister's a vet, you know," he told the wolf, talking to keep himself alert. "Andrea would know exactly how to help you. She's in Bozeman, though, too far away. But she taught me some things. Enough to keep you alive until we get help." The wolf made no response. Only the subtle rise and fall of its side beneath Ethan's jacket indicated it still clung to life. A sudden crack split the night as the lock's mechanism finally gave way under Ethan's persistent efforts. The victory sent a surge of adrenaline through his system, momentarily clearing the fog of cold that had settled over his mind. "Got it," he exclaimed, fingers fumbling with the now open padlock. "We did it, buddy." But removing the chain proved to be another challenge entirely. The links had frozen to the wolf's fur in places, fused by ice and dried blood where the metal had cut into flesh. Each attempt to unwind the chain elicited a faint whimper from the previously stoic animal. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, working as gently as his numb hands would allow. "I know it hurts." Almost done. The final section of chain had become embedded in the wolf's neck, the skin grown around it in what must have been weeks or months of captivity. Ethan felt rage building inside him, providing a different kind of warmth. "What kind of monster?" he started, unable to complete the thought. With painful slowness, link by link, he unwound the chain. The wolf's blood, alarmingly dark in the beam of the flashlight, stained the snow beneath them. Ethan knew that blood loss in these temperatures would accelerate hypothermia, making an already dire situation even worse. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the last link came free. The wolf was no longer bound to the tree, though the collar remained fastened around its neck. Removing it would require veterinary assistance to avoid further injury. "You're free," Ethan said, his voice breaking with exhaustion and emotion. "You're free now." He gathered his jacket more securely around the wolf's emaciated form, preparing to carry it back to his truck. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, already covering their tracks from minutes before. In the dim glow of the flashlight, Ethan's eyes met the wolf's once more. In that moment, despite his scientific skepticism, he could have sworn he saw something profoundly human in that gaze, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even gratitude. "Let's get you home," Ethan said, steeling himself for the final challenge of carrying the wolf back through the blizzard to safety. With trembling arms, Ethan lifted the wolf from its icy prison. Despite its emaciated state, the animal was still substantially heavy, at least 80 pounds of dead weight. The metal collar remained around its neck, a cruel reminder of its captivity. "All right, here we go," Ethan grunted, cradling the wolf awkwardly against his chest. He had taken only 3 steps when he felt the wolf's body suddenly go completely limp. The subtle tension that had been present in its muscles, even in near unconsciousness, disappeared entirely. "No, no, no," Ethan gasped, carefully lowering the wolf onto the snow. "Don't do this. Not now." He pressed his fingers against the animal's rib cage, searching desperately for signs of life. The heartbeat he found was alarmingly faint and irregular, a stuttering rhythm that threatened to cease altogether at any moment. "Breathe, damn it," Ethan commanded, his voice carried away by the howling wind. The wolf's pale golden eyes remained closed, its jaw slack. In the harsh beam of the flashlight, Ethan could see the true extent of the animal's condition. Beyond the starvation and hypothermia, there were older wounds, scars that spoke of systematic abuse rather than the natural injuries of the wild. One ear was partially missing, and a pattern of small, circular burns dotted its flank beneath the matted fur. "What did they do to you?" he whispered, horror and anger competing for dominance. The wolf gave no response. its body completely still now except for the shallowest of breaths, so slight that the movement was barely perceptible even when Ethan placed his hand directly on the animal's chest. The situation was critical. Ethan knew that without immediate intervention, the wolf would die here in the snow. He'd seen hypothermia victims before during his wilderness first aid training. The shutdown of the body's systems followed a predictable pattern, and this wolf was in the final stages. "You didn't survive all that just to die now," Ethan said firmly, as though his words alone could command the wolf to live. He removed his wool shirt despite the biting cold, adding it as another layer over his jacket that already covered the wolf. Clad now in only a thin thermal undershirt, Ethan felt the full force of the Montana winter against his skin. His own survival was becoming questionable, but he pushed the thought aside. With renewed determination, he gathered the wolf once more into his arms. The return journey to his truck was a blur of stumbling steps and near falls. The snow had deepened considerably in the time he'd spent freeing the wolf, now reaching mid-thigh in some drifts. Each step required enormous effort, his muscles burning with exertion even as the cold threatened to shut them down entirely. "Just a little farther," he encouraged, though whether he was talking to the wolf or himself was unclear. When the dim glow of his truck's headlights finally cut through the curtain of snow, Ethan nearly wept with relief. His vision had begun to tunnel, a dangerous sign of his own advancing hypothermia. Reaching the passenger door, he fumbled with the handle using hands that felt like foreign objects attached to his arms. The door swung open, and with the last of his strength, Ethan gently placed the wolf across the bench seat. "We made it," he said, his words slurring slightly. "We made it out." But as he straightened up, preparing to close the door and circle to the driver's side, he saw that the wolf had collapsed completely. Its body was unnaturally still, a lifeless heap of bone and fur on the seat. "No," Ethan cried, reaching for the wolf's neck to check for a pulse. The faint flutter beneath his fingertips was barely detectable, a whisper of life rather than its full voice. The wolf's body temperature had dropped so low that it felt barely warmer than the metal collar still fastened around its neck. In that moment, looking at the nearly lifeless form before him, Ethan made a silent promise. If this wolf survived, he would make sure it never suffered abuse again. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would protect this creature that had endured so much cruelty at human hands. "You're not dying today," he said with quiet intensity, closing the passenger door and rushing to the driver's side. As he started the engine and cranked the heater to its maximum setting, Ethan glanced at the wolf's motionless form. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, the animal looked almost peaceful, as though it had already surrendered to the inevitable. But Ethan Carter wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not tonight. Not in this blizzard. Not with this wolf, whose suffering had already been too great. "Just hold on," he whispered, putting the truck in gear and carefully pulling back onto the snow-covered road. "Just hold on a little longer." The truck fishtailed as Ethan accelerated onto the snow-covered road, his tires struggling to find traction. The speedometer inched upward, 30, 35, 40 miles per hour, each increment a calculated risk on the treacherous mountain roads. Under normal conditions, Ethan was cautious to a fault, but tonight, caution meant certain death for the wolf slumped lifelessly on the seat beside him. 40 minutes, he muttered, squinting through the windshield where his wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless snow. That's if the roads are passable all the way. The nearest veterinary clinic was in a small town called Riversend, barely more than a crossroads with a gas station and a few hardy businesses that somehow survived Montana's brutal winters. Dr. Sarah Bennett kept irregular hours, but Ethan knew she lived above the clinic and responded to emergencies regardless of the time. "Hang in there, buddy," Ethan said, reaching over to place his hand on the wolf's side, desperately searching for the rise and fall of breathing. The wolf's fur felt like ice beneath his fingers. Its ribs, so prominent they could be individually counted, barely moved. Ethan cranked the heat higher, though the truck's ancient system was already maxed out, the vents blasting air that was only now beginning to warm. His phone showed no service as they wound through the mountain pass. No way to call ahead, no way to summon help if they slid off the road. They were entirely alone in this race against time. "I need you to fight," Ethan told the wolf, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't do this alone." At a particularly sharp curve, The truck's rear end slid dangerously close to the edge of the road where a steep embankment waited. Ethan corrected, perhaps too sharply, and felt the vehicle tilt precariously before settling back onto all four wheels. The wolf's body shifted with the movement, sliding partially off the seat. "Shit!" Ethan exclaimed, taking one hand off the wheel to prevent the animal from falling to the floor. The momentary distraction nearly cost them everything, the truck drifting across the center line just as the headlights of an oncoming vehicle appeared around the bend. Ethan swerved back into his lane with mere feet to spare, the passing driver honking angrily as they raced by. "Sorry," he breathed, heart hammering in his chest. "Sorry about that." 25 minutes into their journey, the wolf's breathing became even more labored, a rattling, wheezing sound that cut through the roar of the heater. Ethan recognized the sound from his wilderness first aid training. The animal's lungs were beginning to fill with fluid, a common complication of severe hypothermia. "No, no, no," he pleaded, pressing his right hand against the wolf's chest while steering with his left. "Don't give up now." The town of Riversend appeared in the distance, a handful of lights glimmering through the snowfall like distant stars. Ethan's relief was tempered by the wolf's deteriorating condition. The animal hadn't moved or made a sound beyond its ragged breathing for the entire journey. As they entered the town limits, Ethan fumbled for his phone again. One bar of service, enough to make a call. He dialed Dr. Bennett's emergency line while navigating the slippery streets, praying she would answer. After 4 rings, a groggy voice came on the line. "Bennett Veterinary." "Sarah, it's Ethan Carter," he said urgently. "I'm 5 minutes out with a critically hypothermic wolf. Starvation, possible abuse, definitely in shock." There was a pause, then the sound of movement. "A wolf." Her voice was suddenly alert. "Are you certain?" "Yes, or at least mostly wolf. Found him chained to a tree in the blizzard. He's barely breathing, body temperature dangerously low." "I'll be ready," she said crisply. "Come to the back in trance." The line went dead as Ethan turned onto the final road leading to the clinic. The wolf had gone completely still again. No visible breathing, no response when Ethan called to it. Only by placing his fingers directly against the animal's throat could he detect the faintest pulse, a weak flutter that seemed to be fading with each passing second. "We're almost there," he said, his own voice sounding strange in his ears, distant and hollow. The first stages of his own hypothermia were setting in after his exposure to the elements without proper protection. His hands had regained some feeling, but it wasn't the normal sensation of warmth returning. Instead, they burned and throbbed painfully, a warning sign of potential damage. The clinic's lights came into view, and Ethan saw a figure waiting at the back door, Dr. Bennett, wearing a heavy coat thrown hastily over what appeared to be pajamas. She waved him into the small parking area, already moving toward the truck before he had fully stopped. Ethan threw the vehicle into park and stumbled out, circling to the passenger side where the wolf lay motionless. "He's still alive," he called to Sarah as she approached, but just barely. Together, they carefully lifted the wolf from the seat. In the harsh light of the clinic's exterior lamps, the animal looked even worse than before, its fur dull and patchy, its frame skeletal, the metal collar crusted with blood and ice. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her professional composure momentarily slipping. "What happened to this animal?" "Someone left him to die," Ethan replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Chained him to a tree in the middle of nowhere during the worst blizzard of the season." They carried the wolf through the back door into the warmth of the clinic. Sarah had already prepared an examination table, warming blankets plugged in and ready. "His heart's still beating," she confirmed after a quick check with her stethoscope. "But it's arrhythmic and weak. We need to warm him gradually. Too fast could send him into shock." As she worked, attaching monitors and inserting in 4-line with practiced efficiency, Ethan stood back, suddenly aware of his own shivering. The adrenaline that had carried him through the rescue was fading, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and pain. "You should get yourself checked out," Sarah said without looking up from her work. "You're not looking too great yourself." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not leaving until I know he's stable." Dr. Bennett met his eyes briefly, reading the determination there, and gave a short nod. "Then at least put these on," she said, tossing him a set of scrubs from a nearby cabinet. "Your clothes are soaked through." As Ethan changed in the adjacent bathroom, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. Pale skin, lips tinged slightly blue, dark circles under his eyes. He barely recognized himself, but it was the expression in his eyes that gave him pause, a fierce, protective look he hadn't seen there before. Returning to the examination room, he found Sarah listening intently to the wolf's chest, her expression grave. "Will he make it?" Ethan asked, afraid to hear the answer. Dr. Bennett straightened up, meeting his gaze directly. "The next few hours will tell. He's fighting, but—" She trailed off, looking down at the wolf's emaciated form. "He's been through so much already." Ethan moved to the table, placing his hand gently on the wolf's head. "Fight," he whispered. "I found you for a reason. Fight." The overnight hours at Bennett Veterinary Clinic ticked by with excruciating slowness. Ethan sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair beside the examination table, watching the shallow rise and fall of the wolf's chest. Dr. Sarah Bennett moved efficiently around the small treatment room, checking vital signs, adjusting for fluids, and periodically examining the animal's responses to stimuli. "His body temperature is up to 94 degrees, she reported sometime after midnight. Her voice hushed in the quiet clinic. "Still hypothermic, but moving in the right direction." Ethan nodded, too exhausted to speak. His own body had finally warmed, though his hands remained painfully tender, the price of working barehanded in sub-zero temperatures. Sarah had insisted on treating his minor frostbite and the laceration on his palm before turning her full attention to the wolf. "You should try to sleep," she suggested, gesturing to a worn couch in the corner of the room. "I'll wake you if anything changes." "I'm fine," Ethan replied automatically, though he was anything but. Every muscle ached from the strain of carrying the wolf through deep snow, and his mind felt foggy with fatigue. Sarah gave him a skeptical look. "The storm's getting worse. Roads will be closed by morning. Looks like we're all stuck here for the duration anyway." Outside, the wind howled against the clinic's windows, punctuating her words. The blizzard that had nearly claimed 2 lives was now reaching its full intensity. "Has he moved at all?" Ethan asked, changing the subject. Sarah shook her head. "Nothing beyond the autonomous responses. That's not unusual in cases like this. The body shuts down non-essential functions to preserve core organs." She hesitated, then added with careful neutrality, "You should prepare yourself, Ethan. Even if he survives the hypothermia, the extent of starvation and previous injuries, his quality of life may be severely compromised." The unspoken suggestion hung in the air between them. Ethan's jaw tightened. "He didn't fight this hard just to be put down," he said firmly. Sarah didn't argue, but her expression remained doubtful as she noted the wolf's vital signs on a chart. "When did you become so invested in wolves?" "Last I heard, you were photographing elk migrations." Ethan stared at the motionless animal. The warming blankets now covering the wolf had hidden the worst of its physical condition, but he couldn't unsee the evidence of systematic abuse. The circular burn marks, the partially missing ear, the raw wounds where the chain had cut into flesh. "This isn't about wolves," he replied quietly. "It's about not looking the other way." Sarah's expression softened. "You always were a sucker for lost causes." "He's not a lost cause," Ethan insisted, leaning forward to place his hand on the wolf's side, feeling the faint movement of breath. "He's still fighting." "Talk to him," Sarah suggested, adjusting the flow rate on the 4. "Sounds strange, but animals in recovery often respond to voice contact. Gives them something to orient to." She stepped away to prepare additional medications, leaving Ethan alone with the wolf. He felt slightly foolish, but began speaking in a low, steady voice. "You know, I never even wanted a dog," he told the unconscious animal. "My cabin's too small. I travel too much for work. Always had excuses." The wolf remained motionless, but Ethan continued. "My sister, the one I mentioned earlier, she's been trying to get me to adopt something for years. Says I spend too much time alone in the mountains. Maybe she's right." He gently touched the area around the metal collar, now cleaned of blood and ice, but still locked in place. Sarah had determined it would require specialized tools to remove without causing further injury. "I'm not sure what you are, exactly," Ethan mused. "Wolf, dog, something in between. But whatever you are, you didn't deserve this." For hours, he maintained his vigil, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in companionable silence. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the small treatment room, a fragile pocket of warmth and hope persisted. Around 3 a.m., Ethan dozed off despite his best efforts, his head dropping forward onto his chest. He jerked awake sometime later to find Sarah checking the wolf's vitals again. "Any change?" he asked groggily. "His heartbeat is stronger," she replied. "More regular. And his temperature is almost normal." A cautious optimism colored her voice, though her professional reserve remained intact. She'd been a veterinarian in rural Montana for 15 years, too experienced to make promises in cases this severe. "What about responsiveness?" Ethan asked. "Still minimal," she admitted. But she broke off as the wolf's paw twitched slightly, a small movement that might have gone unnoticed if they hadn't been watching so intently. "Did you see that?" Ethan asked, suddenly fully awake. Sarah nodded, her clinical detachment momentarily forgotten. "Let's try something." She picked up a small penlight and carefully lifted one of the wolf's eyelids. The pale golden iris contracted in response to the light, a reflexive action, but more than they'd seen before. "His neurological responses are improving," she said, allowing herself a small smile. "It's a good sign." Ethan felt a surge of relief so powerful it left him lightheaded. "He's going to make it." "He's got a long way to go," Sarah cautioned, ever the pragmatist. "But yes, I think he might just pull through." Throughout the remainder of the night, the wolf's condition continued to stabilize. His breathing deepened and became more regular. Occasionally, a paw would twitch or his ears would flicker in response to sounds in the clinic. Each small movement felt like a victory. By dawn, the blizzard had begun to abate, though the roads remained impassable under feet of fresh snow. Ethan, having finally succumbed to exhaustion, slept awkwardly in the plastic chair, his hand resting protectively on the edge of the examination table. He woke to a strange sensation, a subtle pressure against his fingers. Opening his eyes, he found himself looking directly into the wolf's pale golden gaze. The animal was awake, its eyes clear and alert despite its overall weakness. And most remarkably, it had shifted its paw to rest against Ethan's hand. "Sarah?" Ethan called softly, not wanting to break the moment, but needing her to witness this development. "Sarah, he's awake." The wolf's eyes remained fixed on Ethan, not with fear or aggression, but with what seemed like recognition. Against all odds, in the quiet hours of a Montana morning, a connection had formed between rescuer and rescued, tenuous but undeniable. "Well, I'll be damned," Sarah whispered, appearing at Ethan's side. "Looks like your lost cause found something to live for after all." Dr. Sarah Bennett moved with practiced efficiency around the examination room, her initial cautious optimism now tempered by clinical focus. The wolf's awakening, while encouraging, had revealed new concerns that required immediate attention. "I need to do a full assessment now that he's conscious," she explained to Ethan, who still hadn't moved from the wolf's side. "His awareness is a good sign, but we need to address several urgent issues." Ethan nodded, reluctantly stepping back to give Sarah room to work. The wolf's golden eyes followed him, a flicker of what might have been anxiety crossing its gaunt face. "It's okay," Ethan reassured the animal. "She's going to help you." Sarah began her examination, her hands gentle but thorough as she assessed the wolf's condition. The hypothermia is resolving, but dehydration remains severe, and his blood work shows critical electrolyte imbalances. She gestured toward the 4-line delivering fluids. "This is helping, but not quickly enough. I'm going to add a nutrient solution specifically formulated for malnourished animals. We need to be careful. Refeeding syndrome is a serious concern." "Refeeding syndrome?" Ethan questioned. "When a starved body suddenly receives nutrition, it can trigger dangerous metabolic shifts," Sarah explained, preparing the new for solution. "The heart, kidneys, and other organs can essentially go into shock. We have to reintroduce nutrients very gradually." The wolf remained unnaturally still during the examination, only the occasional tensing of muscles betraying its discomfort. When Sarah examined the wounded areas around the collar, however, a low, almost inaudible whimper escaped. "This collar needs to come off," she said firmly. "The wounds underneath are infected, and the metal is preventing proper healing." She disappeared into an adjacent room, returning with what looked like specialized cutting tools. "These are designed for removing embedded collars. I've had to use them too many times with neglect cases." As she approached with the tools, the wolf's demeanor changed dramatically. Its body went rigid, eyes widening in unmistakable fear. A deep, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, but a warning nonetheless, vibrated from its chest. He's afraid of the tools, Ethan realized aloud. Whatever happened to him before? Sarah paused, recognizing the trigger. Talk to him, she instructed Ethan. Distract him while I do this. I can sedate him, but in his weakened state, I'd rather avoid additional drugs if possible. Ethan moved to position himself in the wolf's line of sight, effectively blocking its view of Sarah and the frightening tools. He placed his hand gently on the animal's head, careful to avoid its injuries. Hey, look at me, he said softly. Just focus right here. Nothing bad is going to happen to you anymore. The wolf's eyes locked onto Ethan's, the fear still evident but the warning sound subsiding. Ethan continued speaking in a low, soothing tone, recounting stories of his wilderness photography expeditions, describing the beauty of Montana's landscapes, anything to maintain the animal's attention while Sarah worked on removing the collar. The winter migrations are something to see, he said, maintaining steady eye contact with the wolf. Thousands of elk moving through the valleys like flowing water. I've spent weeks following them, sleeping in the snow just to get the right shot at dawn. Behind him, he could hear the soft metallic sounds of Sarah's tools working on the collar locks. The wolf flinched at a particularly loud click, but Ethan gently redirected its attention. You'd like my cabin, he continued. It's remote, no neighbors for miles. There's a stream that runs nearby, full of trout in the summer. In the winter, it freezes over, creating these incredible ice formations. After several tense minutes, Sarah announced quietly, almost there. The lock mechanism is badly rusted, but it's giving way. The wolf seemed to understand the significance of her words. Its eyes darted briefly to Sarah, then back to Ethan, a new intensity in its gaze. Almost done, Ethan promised. Then no more chains, ever again. With a final metallic snap, the collar came apart. Sarah carefully lifted it away from the wolf's neck, revealing raw, infected skin beneath. The animal released a long breath, as if it had been holding tension for months and could finally let go. Good boy, Sarah murmured, immediately setting to work cleaning the infected wounds. These need antibiotics, but they'll heal now that the collar's gone. She dropped the heavy metal collar into a metal basin with a loud clang. The sound made the wolf startle, but less violently than before. I'd estimate this collar was on for at least 4 to 6 months, Sarah said, her professional tone doing little to hide her anger. The skin has grown around it in places. There's evidence of repeated yanking, either the animal trying to free itself or being forcefully controlled. As she treated the neck wounds, she cataloged the wolf's other injuries with clinical precision. Multiple burn marks consistent with cigarettes, healed fractures in at least 2 ribs, scar tissue suggesting previous lacerations from either whipping or cutting. Each item on her list fueled the anger building in Ethan's chest. Systematic abuse, he said flatly. Sarah nodded grimly. And specific. This wasn't neglect, it was deliberate cruelty, likely over an extended period. She continued her treatment, cleaning wounds, applying antibiotics, and checking for any issues they might have missed in the initial emergency assessment. Throughout the process, the wolf remained focused on Ethan, as though he represented the only safe point in an otherwise threatening world. His malnourishment is severe, Sarah added, running her hands along the wolf's protruding spine. He's lost approximately 35 to 40% of his body weight. Muscle atrophy is significant. Rehabilitation will take months, not weeks. But he'll recover? Ethan pressed. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. Physically, with proper care, most of the damage should heal. The burns will leave scars, and some of the old fractures didn't set properly, which may cause periodic pain. But wolves are remarkably resilient. She paused, then added, behaviorally? That's harder to predict. Animals subjected to this level of abuse often develop lasting psychological issues, fear aggression, stress behaviors, difficulty bonding with humans. Ethan looked at the wolf, still watching him with those intelligent golden eyes. Despite everything it had endured, there was something in that gaze that defied easy categorization, not just animal wariness, but a deeper assessment, as if it were weighing Ethan's trustworthiness against a lifetime of human betrayal. He trusted me enough to let me help him, Ethan said. That's a start. Sarah finished bandaging the neck wounds and stepped back to reassess her patient. The wolf looked markedly different from the frozen, barely living creature they'd brought in hours earlier. Though still dangerously thin and weak, a new alertness animated its features. "We'll continue the 4 fluids and antibiotics," she decided. "I'll prepare a very small amount of specialized recovery food, something that won't overwhelm his system. If he can keep that down, we'll gradually increase portions over the next few days." She began cleaning up her supplies, then added, "Ethan, we need to talk about what happens next. This is clearly a wolf hybrid, legal in Montana, but strictly regulated. Once he's stable, we're required to report him to fish, wildlife, and parks." The implications of her statement hung in the air. Wolf-dog hybrids that had been involved in neglect or abuse cases were rarely placed for adoption due to the complex care they required. The likely outcome would be euthanasia or, best case, placement in a wildlife sanctuary where the animal would live out its days in an enclosure. "Let's focus on getting him healthy first," Ethan said, not ready to confront that reality. "One step at a time." Sarah nodded, respecting his avoidance of the subject for now. "I'm going to prepare his first meal. Small, soft portions of protein and fat. Stay with him. He seems calmer when you're nearby." Left alone with the wolf, Ethan settled back into the chair beside the examination table. The animal's eyes were growing heavy, the exhaustion of treatment and the effects of pain medication beginning to take hold. "We'll figure something out," Ethan promised quietly, gently stroking the wolf's head between its ears. "I'm not giving up on you." The wolf's eyes closed fully, its breathing deepening into sleep. Not the desperate unconsciousness of before, but genuine, healing rest. For the first time since the rescue, Ethan allowed himself to believe that the wolf might truly recover. Outside, the blizzard had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets of Riversend. A new day had begun, for Ethan, for the wolf, and for whatever uncertain future awaited them both. The afternoon light slanted through the clinic windows, casting long shadows across the examination room floor. The wolf had been sleeping peacefully for several hours, its breathing steady and strong, a marked improvement from the previous night's crisis. Ethan sat nearby, alternating between checking his emails on his phone and watching the animal's chest rise and fall with each breath. Dr. Bennett entered, carrying a tablet and wearing a perplexed expression that immediately caught Ethan's attention. "What is it?" he asked, straightening in his chair. "I scanned for a microchip earlier as part of the standard intake procedure," she explained, tapping something on her tablet screen. It registered, but the database was slow to respond because of the storm affecting internet connectivity. The results just came through. She turned the tablet toward Ethan, showing him a screen of information. "He's registered, all right, to a place called Northridge Research Facility." "A research facility?" Ethan repeated, the words leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "What kind of research?" Sarah shook her head. "The database only provides basic ownership information for reunification purposes. But Northridge isn't a name I'm familiar with, and I know most of the animal facilities in this part of Montana." The wolf stirred at the sound of their voices, golden eyes blinking open slowly. No, he, Ethan corrected himself mentally, observed them with that same unsettling intelligence that had struck Ethan from the beginning. "Can you look them up?" Ethan asked, stepping closer to examine the information on the tablet. Sarah was already typing on her phone. "Northridge Research Facility, here it is. They're located about 70 miles northwest of here, near the Canadian border. Their website describes them as a private research institution dedicated to advancing understanding of canid behavior and genetics." "Canid behavior," Ethan repeated flatly. "That's vague." "Deliberately so, I imagine," Sarah agreed, scrolling through the sparse website. "There's very little specific information here about their actual research activities, just generalized statements about furthering scientific knowledge and behavioral studies." Ethan felt the wolf's eyes on him, as if the animal understood they were discussing his origins. "Is there a contact number? We should let them know we found their subject." The last word came out with undisguised contempt. The evidence of abuse on the wolf's body told a story that had nothing to do with legitimate scientific research. Sarah found a contact number and dialed it on the clinic phone, putting it on speaker. After several rings, a crisp, professional voice answered. Northridge Research, this is Dr. Michaels. Hello, this is Dr. Sarah Bennett from Riverside Veterinary Clinic. I'm calling because we've found an animal with a microchip registered to your facility, a wolf hybrid, male, approximately 3 to 4 years old. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Can you provide the microchip number to confirm? Sarah read off the number displayed on her tablet. Yes, that would be subject 37B. The voice confirmed without emotion. When was it located? Ethan bristled at the clinical terminology. He interjected loudly enough to be heard over the speaker. Was found chained to a tree in the middle of a blizzard last night. Starving, hypothermic, and covered in wounds consistent with systematic abuse. Another pause, longer this time. And you are? Ethan Carter. I'm the one who found him and brought him to Dr. Bennett's clinic. Mr. Carter, Northridge appreciates your concern, but Subject 37B is private property and part of an ongoing research protocol. If you could provide your location, we'll send someone to retrieve it within the next 24 hours. Ethan and Sarah exchanged shocked glances. Dr. Michaels, Sarah said, her professional tone strained with barely controlled anger. This animal was found in a condition that constitutes criminal neglect and abuse under Montana state law. Before releasing him to anyone, I'll need documentation of your research protocols, proof of proper licensing for wolf hybrid ownership, and an explanation for the animal's condition. Our research is conducted under proprietary protocols, Dr. Bennett. The documentation you're requesting contains confidential information that we cannot share. As for the animal's condition, Subject 37B was part of a behavioral study that concluded 3 weeks ago. The subject was deemed unsuitable for further research and was scheduled for humane euthanasia, but apparently escaped before the procedure could be performed. Ethan couldn't contain himself. Escaped? He was chained to a tree miles from any road. Are you seriously suggesting he escaped your facility, dragged a heavy chain through the mountains, and then secured himself to a tree to die? Dr. Michaels' voice cooled noticeably. Mr. Carter, you've overstepped. Our internal procedures are not subject to public scrutiny. The animal is microchipped property of Northridge Research. Failure to return it could result in legal action against both you and Dr. Bennett. Sarah met Ethan's eyes, her expression hardening. Dr. Michaels, as a licensed veterinarian, I am legally obligated to report suspected animal abuse to the appropriate authorities. Before releasing this animal to your facility, I will be contacting both the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks and the State Veterinary Board to report these concerns and the animal's condition upon intake. That would be ill-advised, Dr. Bennett. Northridge operates under special research exemptions that do not, Sarah interrupted firmly, include exemptions from basic animal welfare statutes. I'll be documenting all injuries and sending a full report to the authorities today. If your facility wishes to claim this animal, you may do so through the proper legal channels after investigation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Dr. Michaels spoke again, his tone had shifted to one of cold calculation. Given the circumstances, perhaps Northridge should reconsider. Subject 37B was scheduled for termination due to its failure to meet research parameters. The paperwork listing it as laboratory property has already been processed for insurance purposes. Officially, the subject no longer exists in our inventory. Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances, both trying to comprehend what they were hearing. Are you saying you're abandoning ownership claims? Sarah asked carefully. I'm saying that retrieving an animal already processed as terminated would create unnecessary complications in our record keeping. Northridge Research officially has no claim on the animal in question. What happens to it now is no longer our concern. Before either of them could respond, the line went dead. The clinical room fell silent except for the soft beeping of the medical monitors. The wolf's eyes were fully open now, moving between Ethan and Sarah as if following their conversation. Did they just, Ethan began, disavow all responsibility and ownership? Sarah finished. Yes, they did. Quite deliberately. Ethan looked at the wolf, who returned his gaze steadily. They left him to die because he wasn't useful anymore. Chained him up in the wilderness during winter and listed him as terminated in their records. Sarah's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing genuine disgust. Unfortunately, some private research facilities operate in ethical gray areas. Without proper oversight, animals can be treated as disposable tools rather than living beings. She set down her tablet with a decisive motion. I'm still filing reports with Wildlife and Parks and the Veterinary Board. Whatever special exemptions they claim to have, abandoning an animal to die of exposure is illegal, period. The wolf shifted slightly on the examination table, attempting to sit up despite his weakness. Ethan moved to his side, gently supporting him. What happens to him now? Ethan asked quietly. If the research facility has officially abandoned ownership? Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. Legally, he's now a stray, albeit one with special circumstances. Wolf hybrids fall under complex regulations. Eventually, he would need to go to a certified sanctuary or to an owner with proper permits for wolf hybrid ownership. She watched as the wolf leaned subtly into Ethan's touch, seeking contact. But that's not an immediate concern. His recovery needs to be our priority right now. The rest, we'll figure out as we go. Ethan nodded, his mind already racing ahead. The mysterious Northridge facility, their callous abandonment of an animal they had systematically abused, the research they'd been conducting. All of it painted a disturbing picture that he couldn't simply walk away from. The wolf's golden eyes met his again, and Ethan felt that same inexplicable connection, a shared understanding that transcended species. Whatever had happened at Northridge, this wolf had endured it and survived against impossible odds. Now, freed from his physical chains but still bearing the scars of his captivity, he faced an uncertain future. We'll figure it out, Ethan promised again, more to the wolf than to Sarah. Whatever it takes. Outside the clinic windows, the late afternoon sun gleamed on the newly fallen snow, transforming the world into a landscape of blinding white broken only by long blue shadows. Somewhere in that wilderness lay Northridge Research Facility and its secrets, and Ethan had the growing conviction that the wolf story was only the beginning of a much darker mystery. 2 days after the wolf's rescue, the clinic had transformed into a temporary home for both Ethan and his newfound charge. Dr. Bennett had cleared a small recovery room with a cushioned floor mat where the wolf could rest more comfortably than on the examination table. Ethan had taken to sleeping on a cot beside him, unwilling to leave the animal alone after everything that had happened. The wolf's recovery, while far from complete, had progressed remarkably. He could now stand for short periods and had begun accepting small amounts of the specialized diet Sarah had prepared. The infection in his neck wounds was responding to antibiotics, and his eyes, those striking pale gold eyes, had become increasingly alert and aware. He's defying all my expectations, Sarah admitted as she examined the healing wounds around his neck. Most animals in his condition would take weeks just to reach this point. Ethan, who had been making calls on his cell phone, looked up with a grim expression that contrasted with Sarah's positive assessment. I've been doing some digging into Northridge, he said, keeping his voice low though the wolf's ears perked up at the facility's name. And I don't like what I'm finding. Sarah finished checking the wolf's vitals before responding. What have you learned? Not much on paper. They're careful about that. But I've been calling contacts in wildlife photography circles, conservation groups, even a friend who works for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. No one knows exactly what goes on there, but there are rumors. What kind of rumors? Sarah asked, though her expression suggested she already anticipated the answer. Northridge started as a legitimate operation studying wolf migration patterns and pack behavior, Ethan explained. But about 5 years ago, they were acquired by a private corporation called Genix Behavioral Sciences. Since then, they've become increasingly secretive, cutting ties with universities and public research institutions. The wolf had gone completely still, his golden eyes fixed on Ethan as if understanding every word. My contact at Fish and Wildlife says they've received complaints about Northridge, but every time they try to investigate, they're blocked by paperwork, special research exemptions, national security implications, proprietary research protections. National security? Sarah repeated skeptically. For wolf research. Ethan shrugged. That's the claim. But here's where it gets interesting. I found an environmental activist who's been monitoring facilities that do animal testing. He claims Northridge isn't studying natural wolf behavior at all. They're conducting some kind of experimental program involving wolf-dog hybrids specifically bred for enhanced intelligence and trainability. Sarah glanced at the wolf, who continued to watch them intently. For what purpose? Military applications, allegedly. Guard animals, perimeter security, search and rescue in combat zones. Situations where technology might fail, but animal senses would still function. The clinical room fell silent as they both considered the implications. The wolf shifted his weight, a soft whine escaping him as he tried to stand more fully. Easy, Ethan soothed, moving to support the animal's weakened frame. You're not strong enough yet. I need to check on another patient, Sarah said. But we should continue this conversation later. After she left, Ethan helped the wolf settle back onto his cushioned bed. You're quite the mystery, he said quietly, stroking the animal's head. What did they do to you in there? The wolf's response was to lean into Ethan's touch, a gesture that had become increasingly common over the past 2 days. Despite the abuse he had suffered at human hands, this particular wolf seemed capable of distinguishing between those who had hurt him and those trying to help. Ethan's phone rang, interrupting the moment. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number with a local area code. Hello, he answered cautiously. Is this Ethan Carter? A woman's voice asked, speaking barely above a whisper. Yes. Who's calling? My name is Lisa Trent. Until last week, I was a research assistant at Northridge. She paused, her breathing audible through the phone. I heard you found one of the subjects. 37B. Ethan straightened, instantly alert. How did you get my name? Small town. Word travels. A friend of mine works at the gas station in Riversend. Said a man named Ethan Carter was asking questions about Northridge, that he'd rescued a wolf. The wolf's ears had perked up again, his attention fixed on Ethan's suddenly tense posture. What do you want, Miss Trent? To help, she replied simply. And maybe to make amends. What they're doing at Northridge, it's not right. I tried to convince myself it was for the greater good, that the research had legitimate applications. But after what they did to the Phase 3 subjects, she trailed off, emotion threatening to overwhelm her voice. Phase 3, Ethan prompted. The Intelligence Enhancement Program. They started with standard behavioral conditioning, moved to pharmaceutical interventions, and finally, to other methods. More invasive ones. Ethan looked at the wolf, remembering the strange scars he'd observed during the initial examination. What kind of invasive methods? I can't discuss it over the phone, Lisa replied. But 37B was special, different from the others. He could. She hesitated again. Things I can't explain. That's why they were so upset when he didn't respond as expected to the final testing protocols. He was supposed to be their breakthrough case. The wolf had risen to his feet despite his weakness, golden eyes fixed unblinkingly on the phone in Ethan's hand. Why are you telling me this? Ethan asked. Because they're looking for him, Lisa said urgently. Regardless of what Dr. Michaels told you, they want him back. The official record might show 37B as terminated, but unofficially, there's been a security team dispatched to locate him. They can't risk him being found and examined by outside experts. A chill ran through Ethan. Why not? What would they find? Evidence of what they've been doing, Lisa whispered. The program isn't sanctioned, not even under their special exemptions. The modifications, the procedures, none of it would pass any ethical review board. Modifications? Ethan repeated, his gaze locked with the wolf's. What exactly did they do to him? Lisa's voice became even softer. They wanted to create something that wasn't just animal, wasn't just instinct. Something that could understand complex commands, anticipate human needs, make independent decisions while remaining absolutely loyal. They wanted to create the perfect companion, the perfect soldier. The wolf took a faltering step toward Ethan, then another, his legs trembling with the effort. Mr. Carter, you need to get him away from Riversend, Lisa continued urgently. They know he's at the veterinary clinic. They'll be there by tomorrow morning at the latest. How can I trust you? Ethan demanded. This could be a setup to get me to move him somewhere they can intercept us. You can't trust me, she acknowledged. But you can verify what I'm telling you. The chip isn't just for identification, it's a tracker. They can pinpoint his location within 50 feet. And there's something else you should know. A noise in the hallway made Lisa fall silent. Ethan heard muffled voices, then what sounded like a door closing. I have to go, she whispered frantically. They monitor staff communications. If they know I've contacted you, wait, Ethan interrupted. What else should I know about him? There was a moment of silence. Then Lisa spoke in a rush. The program worked, Mr. Carter. 37B isn't just intelligent for an animal. He understands. Everything. Words, concepts, emotions. He's still a wolf in instinct and needs, but his comprehension, it's beyond anything we anticipated. That's why they can't let him go. And that's why he needs someone who will see him as more than an experiment. The line went dead before Ethan could respond. He lowered the phone slowly, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. In front of him, the wolf stood on trembling legs, his golden eyes fixed on Ethan's face with an intensity that suddenly held new meaning. Not just animal intelligence or instinct, but understanding, comprehension, awareness. Can you? Ethan began, feeling slightly ridiculous despite Lisa's claims. Can you understand what I'm saying? Really understand? The wolf held his gaze for a long moment, then deliberately, unmistakably, nodded his head. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. That's why they abandoned you. You weren't responding to their protocols because you were making your own choices. Another nod, slower this time, the wolf's legs beginning to buckle under the strain of standing. Ethan moved forward instantly, supporting the animal before he could fall. We need to leave, he said, his decision made. Tonight. If what Lisa said is true, we're not safe here. The wolf leaned against him, a gesture that now carried far greater significance than simple physical weakness. It was trust, communication, an acknowledgement of their shared predicament. I don't know what they did to you, Ethan said softly, but I promise you this. You're not going back there. Ever. As if in response, the wolf pressed his head against Ethan's hand, a gesture so deliberate, so human in its intent, that it erased any lingering doubts. Whatever Northridge had created in their laboratories, whatever line they had crossed between animal and something more, the result was now looking at Ethan with eyes that held not just intelligence, but a soul. The snow-covered Montana highway stretched before them, illuminated only by the truck's headlights as Ethan drove through the night. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m., nearly 4 hours since their hasty departure from Dr. Bennett's clinic. In the passenger seat, wrapped in blankets, the wolf rested with his head propped against the window, golden eyes reflecting the occasional passing lights. We should be safe for now, Ethan said, breaking the silence that had persisted since they crossed the county line. My cabin is off the grid, no electricity connection, no mailbox, nothing that links it to official records. Just a hunting lease registered to a shell company my grandfather set up years ago. The wolf turned his gaze from the window to Ethan, that now familiar look of comprehension clear in his eyes. Sarah helped us more than she should have, Ethan continued, still adjusting to the idea of having a truly one-sided conversation. Gave us medication, supplies, didn't ask too many questions about where we were going. She'll have plausible deniability if Northridge comes asking. Their departure had been carefully orchestrated once Sarah learned of Lisa's warning. The veterinarian had created a diversion, moving another patient noisily through the front of the clinic while Ethan and the wolf slipped out the back in trance. Sarah had even kept the wolf's medical records deliberately vague, noting only large canine, stray, in her official documentation. She's sending someone to move my truck from the clinic parking lot tomorrow, Ethan added. Make it look like I left town in a different direction. The wolf shifted position slightly, a soft whine escaping him as he adjusted his still healing body. We'll be there in about an hour, Ethan promised. It's not much, but it's safe. Isolated. No one will find us there while you recover. As the miles passed, Ethan's mind returned repeatedly to the revelation of the wolf's true nature. The animal's deliberate nod had shaken him to his core, confirming in an instant what should have been impossible. Yet each interaction since had only reinforced the truth. The wolf understood language, concepts, and nuance in a way that transcended animal cognition. I wonder what I should call you, Ethan mused aloud. 37B isn't exactly a name. The wolf's ears perked up at this, his head tilting in what appeared to be consideration. How about Shadow? Ethan suggested, then immediately shook his head. No, too obvious for a wolf. Timber? That's not much better. The wolf huffed softly, a sound remarkably like disapproval. Fair enough, Ethan chuckled. I'm not great at naming things. My sister's cat is literally named Cat. They drove on in companionable silence, leaving the main highway for increasingly remote forest roads. Eventually, Ethan turned onto what barely qualified as a path, a narrow track through dense pine forest, unmarked and nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Almost there, he said as the truck bounced over the uneven terrain. Road ends about a quarter-mile ahead. The cabin's just beyond that. The wolf straightened slightly, looking out the windshield with renewed interest as the headlights illuminated a small clearing ahead. In the center stood a rustic log cabin, simple but sturdy, with a covered porch and smoke-stained chimney. Solar panels on the south-facing roof provided minimal electricity, enough for basic needs but insufficient to register on any utility grid. "Home sweet home," Ethan announced, parking the truck beside a modest woodshed. "Been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it, my father expanded it, and I've maintained it. Nobody knows about this place except my sister, and even she hasn't visited in years." He turned off the engine, the sudden silence of the forest enveloping them. The night was clear now, stars visible through the canopy of trees surrounding the clearing. In the distance, an owl called, a familiar sound that had always signaled homecoming to Ethan. "Let's get you inside," he said, circling to the passenger side. "I'll have to carry you. The snow's too deep for you to walk through in your condition." The wolf didn't resist as Ethan carefully lifted him from the seat. Despite several days of proper nutrition, the animal remained dangerously thin, his once powerful frame diminished by starvation and abuse. Yet there was new strength in his body, the beginning of recovery that Sarah had called remarkable. The cabin door creaked as Ethan pushed it open with his shoulder, ducking slightly to enter with his burden. Inside, the air was cold but not freezing, the thick log walls providing natural insulation against Montana's winter. "Let me get a fire going first," Ethan said, gently setting the wolf on a worn leather couch near the stone fireplace. "Then we'll get settled." With practiced efficiency, Ethan arranged kindling and logs in the fireplace, struck a match, and carefully nurtured the small flame until it caught properly. Warm light gradually filled the single-room cabin, illuminating its simple furnishings: the couch, a small kitchenette along one wall, a desk beneath the window, and a bed in the far corner. Photographs lined the walls, mostly wilderness shots that Ethan had taken over years of professional work. The wolf watched intently as Ethan moved around the cabin, bringing in supplies from the truck, preparing a meal for them both on the small propane stove, and setting up a comfortable bed near the fireplace specifically for his new companion. "It's not much," Ethan acknowledged as he worked, "but it's peaceful. I come here between assignments to process photographs, write articles, recharge. No internet, no cell service, just books, nature, and quiet." He placed a bowl of the special recovery food Sarah had prepared on the floor near the wolf. "Sarah says you need to eat small amounts frequently." Building back slowly, the wolf eased himself down from the couch with careful movements, approaching the bowl. He ate with deliberate dignity despite his obvious hunger, a far cry from the desperate feeding Ethan might have expected from a starving animal. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next steps," Ethan said, settling into an armchair with his own simple meal of canned soup. "For tonight, just rest. You're safe here." As the evening progressed into night, a comfortable routine established itself. Ethan tended the fire, organized their supplies, and prepared the cabin for what might be an extended stay. The wolf observed everything with those intelligent golden eyes, occasionally moving to a different vantage point within the cabin, but never straying far from Ethan. Later, as Ethan sat at his desk reviewing the minimal information he'd gathered about Northridge, the wolf approached and sat beside him, looking pointedly at the papers. "Trying to help?" Ethan asked with a slight smile. The wolf nudged Ethan's hand with his nose, then looked deliberately at a pen lying on the desk. Ethan stared, suddenly understanding. "Can you? Would you be able to?" He placed the pen on the floor, along with a blank sheet of paper. The wolf regarded these items for a long moment, then carefully took the pen in his mouth. With obvious difficulty but unmistakable purpose, he made several awkward marks on the paper. The result was barely legible, crude lines formed by a mouth never meant for writing, but recognizable nonetheless. "Loki. Loki?" Ethan read aloud, amazement in his voice. Is that your name?" The wolf, Loki, dropped the pen and nodded, looking exhausted from the effort but satisfied with the communication. "Loki," Ethan repeated softly. "The trickster god from Norse mythology. Clever, unpredictable, refusing to be controlled." He smiled. "It suits you." Loki's eyes, tired but alert, held Ethan's gaze in silent acknowledgement. This simple exchange, this impossible act of communication, cemented what Ethan had begun to accept since Lisa's phone call. Whatever had been done to this wolf had crossed boundaries of science and ethics that perhaps should have remained uncrossed. Yet the result was not a monster or an experiment gone wrong, but a being of extraordinary intelligence trapped in a wolf's body, seeking only what any sentient creature desired: freedom, safety, and connection. As the night deepened, Loki finally settled on the bed Ethan had prepared, his thin body gradually relaxing into genuine rest. Ethan remained awake longer, watching the rise and fall of the wolf's side, his mind racing with questions about what the future might hold for them both. Northridge would not give up easily. Lisa had made that clear. The wolf, Loki, represented too much invested research, too many secrets. But the alternative, returning him to those who had abused him, who saw him as nothing more than a subject, was unthinkable. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes illuminated by moonlight as they drifted past the cabin windows. The forest stood silent sentinel around them, offering temporary sanctuary in its remote embrace. Ethan moved to add another log to the fire, ensuring the cabin would remain warm throughout the night. As he did, Loki's eyes opened briefly, tracking his movement before closing again in implicit trust. "We'll figure this out," Ethan promised quietly, an echo of words he'd spoken in the veterinary clinic that now carried new weight. "Whatever happens, we're in this together now." He settled into his own bed, listening to the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional distant call of night creatures in the forest. So much had changed in the span of 3 days. His solitary life upended by a chance encounter in a blizzard, his understanding of the world fundamentally altered by a wolf who could understand human speech and even communicate in return. Yet despite the uncertainty, despite the danger that surely lay ahead, Ethan felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd experienced in years. In saving Loki, he had found something he hadn't realized was missing: a connection that transcended ordinary bonds between human and animal. As sleep finally claimed him, Ethan's last conscious thought was of those golden eyes, intelligent, aware, and now focused on a future that, while uncertain, held the promise of freedom. For both of them, a new chapter had begun, one they would write together, one day at a time. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment "I watched this far" and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's very exciting.